Team 3DMJ Nation, welcome. We are going to talk about everybody's favorite subject, something that everybody loves to do, and that is cardiovascular exercise. But more importantly, how we use cardio in bodybuilding and preparation for bodybuilding. So I am joined today by the Godfather, Jeff Alberts. Coach, how's it going?
I'm good. I haven't done my cardio yet today, but I'm good, Brad.
And we've got Team 3DMJ's resident hockey player, Coach Brian Miner. Brian, how's it going?
Doing well.
All righty, guys. I have to kind of confess to an epiphany that I had well into my coaching career when I came to the conclusion that bodybuilders don't have to do cardio. Cardio is a tool that we use to manage the caloric deficit, right? And I almost had like a little bit of resistance to cardio for a while because I was practicing my coaching skills, and can I actually get through an entire prep without doing any cardio at all? But it raises the question, how do we program cardio right now? How do we use cardio? What do we look for in our athletes in how we are going to prescribe an athlete's cardio, etc.? I know I've got my go-tos, but I'm going to shut up for a second. I'm going to throw the podium, the pulpit, the microphone over to Brian. And Brian, how do you? What's your go-to for cardio expenditure, maintaining the deficit, etc.?
Yeah, it's an interesting topic. I think it starts with let's for the sake of this discussion assume we're talking about a fat loss phase, right? So
makes sense.
Let's say we're aiming for a 4,000 calorie deficit a week, just picking a random number. Now, how do we allocate that across the days? And to build on what you said, cardio is a tool. It's for most people not going to be the primary vehicle for creating the deficit. Like it's going to be much more efficient for most people to reduce their caloric intake to create, the largest proportion of their deficit and then increase their expenditure through, either additional steps or dedicated cardiovascular work in order to kind of get us up to that point. But I like to structure with bodybuilders in particular, I like to structure it so, like, let's pretend they couldn't do any cardio for a given week for whatever reason. We still want a reasonable deficit in place. And so that's how I approach it. Like, we're not relying on the cardio to move the needle, but it's helping sustain the pace that we want. And, when it comes to types, I think, step count is, pretty popular to use. And I think for good reason. A lot of the adaptations we see through fat loss phases are reductions to non-exercise activity. And that it can help partially offset that. I know, I've done preps where I just did, it was 4 sessions a week, aim for 1,600 calories of total expenditure or something like that. And granted, I mean, there's no way of knowing where your actual expenditure is, but if you plug your stats in on a machine, it's like, as long as it's consistent, you kind of it's a reasonable way to go. But what I found when I just did that was in those latter stages of prep, I would, baseline fatigue levels were high enough where, I would train, do my cardio, and it was like checking a box, like, down. Okay, now I can chill for the rest of the day. And so that's where I found steps helped me a lot. Was it helped keep me accountable there, so I wasn't having those lulls when your body is wanting to just sit still the rest of the day. So yeah, I think step count, but I do think there's having, included within that, sometimes I'll program some additional cardio, and it really depends on the situation there. But, I might say aim for 8 to 10K, within that 2 to 3 sessions of, 20 to 30 minutes, maintaining, like a zone 2 level of heart rate. So yeah, that's sort of the broad way I kind of go about things.
that's kind of how it was for me. Like, I want to say this was probably our first couple of years of coaching. So we're talking 2011 or 12, somewhere in that vicinity. Because I don't think we were using step counts back
I
then.
know we weren't. Yeah.
Yeah. So
I know you were, because
yeah.
that was back when I was an athlete
of
pretty damn
Berto's.
young,
Yeah,
and I
Alberto's,
worked with Bert.
So-
And I
so-
remember it was like, went from like 2 400 calorie sessions up to like 400
Yeah.
calorie sessions.
So,
you
yeah,
know?
I'll give
that's
you an
how we did it a
example.
lot of times. Yeah.
Yeah.
One athlete in
It
particular,
worked.
it sticks out like a sore thumb, and where I kind of realized like, oh crap, like this guy's just stopped moving. It was same thing. It was, we hit a plateau and calories were already pretty low. And I'm like, okay, I don't want to drop calories even lower because it's going to make his training rough. So I'm like, okay, let me increase his cardio. So like you, Brian, it went from like 2 to 3 to 4, no movement whatsoever. So I was like, okay, let me go up to, I ended up going to 6 cardio sessions a week, 400 calories per session, and nothing moved. Like he was not dropping any weight, no visual changes either, like nothing on the scale. So of course, in a nice way, polite way, I'm like, hey, are you sure you're adhering to your diet? You know, we're rock solid there. He's, you know, and he basically said, yeah, Jeff, I'm 100% on point with diet. So this went on for like 3, 4, 5 weeks where it was nothing. And then in one of his check-ins, he goes, yeah, I forgot to tell you that I've been noticing like I'm watching more TV and taking naps. And then it kind of hit me. It was like, okay, so I'm increasing his cardio. He's moving, but the other parts of the day, he's no longer moving. That's when it kind of clicked. Like there needs to be a better way to be able to track overall activity level. And that's why step counts is so important, because at least you have some type of metric to be able to account for overall activity. So even if someone is tired, you're deep into a prep and you have, let's say their step count is 8 to 10,000 steps, like it gives them incentive to keep that going, even though they're feeling, let's say, a little fatigued and they don't want to move. So I think it's an important tool to use step counts. And I'll be honest, I did an Instagram post. This is like a week or so ago, and the post was explaining why I'm going to run a cut pre-prep positioning, but a lot of it has to do with my overall health. And I didn't put in cardio. It's just more of a step count. Well, I got bashed like from a couple people saying you should be doing cardio. Bodybuilders, like they're just doing this step count thing. And I've seen bodybuilders who are like 6% body fat, but they can't run a 5K. And I'm like, well, that's the goal of a 6% body fat is not to run a 5K, it's to look shredded.
Exactly.
You know? So, but it made me really think about, like, even though maybe he come across a little harsh, I was like, okay, he had me thinking like, okay, it is important that we have some type of conditioning there from a overall health perspective. So I guess question for you guys, I know Brad, you started this out and you were asking the questions, but I'm gonna flip it. So you guys, as far as cardio, like how much, like weight training, for example, how much is cardiovascular? Meaning if we're like in the, I don't know, 12 to 20 rep range or 10 to 20 reps, and you guys are going all out, heart rate's obviously elevating, and then you rest for a minute and then you go do it again. Like how much of a benefit are we getting there? And is it enough for us as, like, say, average bodybuilders, like not highly competitive bodybuilders, but bodybuilders as in, hey, we're serious about our lifting, we're just trying to look and feel better. Like, is that adequate?
I can actually,
or do we need to do more? Like we need to do like zone 2, like we need to do something like that.
I can actually answer that in a couple of different ways, just because I have a cardiologist that watches my cardiovascular health, right? Because of the coronary artery disease that I have. And essentially when it comes to health, my cardiologist, I remember vividly saying that for most people that are healthy and under the age of like 50, weight training is fine, because yes, it's anaerobic in that your heart rate is elevated and then it comes back down, and then it's elevated and then it comes back down, and then it's elevated. So basically that is cardiovascular exercise right there. You get out of breath, your heart rate's elevated, and you basically, when it's anaerobic, you basically work to a point to where your heart can't keep up. Your body has to slow down at some point, whether that be voluntarily, or you just throw up or pass out, right? But that's essentially anaerobic exercise. And he said that suffices. Now, when you're talking about older folks that basically anaerobic exercise doesn't cut it, now we have to kind of get the heart rate up to where it's not to an anaerobic level, but it needs to be sustained for, yeah, 20, 15, 20 minutes, whatever, their recommendation is, right? So this circles back to the bodybuilder, right? And just like you said, Jeff, it's not the goal of a bodybuilder to run a 6-minute mile. It's not the goal of a bodybuilder to do anything cardiovascular, right? It's the goal of a bodybuilder to get to the lowest body fat levels possible while holding on to all of their muscle. And then what cardiovascular endurance they do need to have is to hold their poses, right? And so when it comes to bodybuilders, I take a little bit of context as the person that I'm dealing with, right? And if I can have a bodybuilder get through a prep and get to the levels of conditioning that I want without any cardio at all, I'll do it, because the cardiovascular exercise that they're getting from the anaerobic portion of their weight training is enough to keep up their cardiovascular health. And then, of course, with older bodybuilders, maybe I can get them to the conditioning that I want without any cardiovascular exercise at all. But is that a real good idea? Maybe for somebody who in the off season, maybe they combat, hypertension. Maybe they have diabetes, in the family, on the intake form, etc. Maybe those folks, yeah, we do incorporate some sort of sustained aerobic cardiovascular exercise, more so for health than anything, but it could help us, as far as the bodybuilding front goes. So, Jeff, I hope that I answered your question, and I'm sure if I didn't, Brian will.
No, I think I agree with everything you said there. I think it's, when we're dealing with bodybuilders, a lot of them have this phobia of doing cardio. And I think that's also unjustified. And so the way I look at it is I might be a little bit more proactive in assigning additional cardio. And it really depends on the athlete too, like the rep range they're training in. Like let's say we have a 100-kilo powerlifter who's not in great cardiovascular shape, and they're resting, 7 minutes between sets. And it's at that point.
Why are you talking about me, Brian?
You're not 100 kilos, Jeff.
That's true.
At that point, it's like adding some cardio would benefit the resistance training. If you can increase your work capacity within the session, like increasing your work capacity is never like the bottom line goal, really, because it's not like what we can maximally benefit from. Like oftentimes we can perform more work than that. But if you're to borrow a term, from Mike Isertel, like the minimum effective volume, to the maximum recoverable, sometimes people's work capacity is right around that minimum effective dose, of what they can. Yeah. So it's in those cases, you need to gain some conditioning just in order for training to be productive. I mean, if you do a set of 8 to a couple reps in reserve, rest 5 minutes, and get a set of 5, it's like, okay.
In your off season at a higher body fat level,
yeah.
Probably,
And that's not an outrageous example. I mean, that can happen.
That was me. I ain't shitting you. That was me back in 2012, 2013 off seasons where it's like I'm over 200 pounds. Yeah, I'm moving a lot of weight, but I'm resting 5 minutes in between sets.
Yeah.
And you ask me to go up a flight of stairs and I'm out of breath. Like, that's not the healthiest place to be.
It's not. And so I try to encourage, a couple sessions a week, and I can kind of leave them. So going back on what I said earlier, I'll often do a step goal and then included within that aim for 2 to 3 sessions. So even if they're not doing dedicated cardio sessions, prioritize the steps. But, we know that weight training has a cardiovascular benefit to it. And we know, like the research on rest intervals, if you progressively decrease your rest interval, you see a smaller drop off, as you become more conditioned to the shorter rest. Like you develop and adapt to the fact you're resting less. And so we know that that has a benefit, that the weight training has a benefit there. But, if there's a lean 20-year-old who's a hard gainer in the off, and they're in the off season, I probably will give them just a step goal just to stay loose more than anything,
Right.
so they're not just sitting around all day. But it's not, the role of cardio just kind of depends on the situation, but it's never to drive fat loss. It's usually just to get that last 25%, in my opinion. That's that. I kind of try to bias about 75% of the deficit from the diet when I can.
What about in smaller individuals?
Yeah, so that
Where
That's
calories
the question.
like calories
Yeah.
are like really uber low, and it's like,
Yeah.
okay, if you take them any
I
lower,
think-
they're probably going to, even though you have a step count target there, it's like, man, it's like, how people cheat on their diet. Like, I think I must cheat on my steps today
yeah,
because I don't
yeah.
feel like moving.
Exactly. So I think, anybody who's prepped smaller athletes, lighter athletes, it does seem to be less predictable oftentimes because of that. And, to your point with your athlete where you were adding, increasing the cardio sessions up to 6 times a week and nothing budged, like the NEAT definitely contributed there. But
Yeah.
there's also the element, past a point, like adding steps, you're not going to get the same return. The more calorically restricted, like the lower your energy availability, the less additional steps are going to really help, and that's like the idea of like the constrained energy model. And to kind of plug Dr. Mike Israetel with RP, he recently had Eric Trexler on to talk about this, and I would encourage people to check that out. But the idea is, if you can only increase physical activity so much to the point where additional physical activity isn't going to predictably and reliably increase your total daily energy
Yep.
expenditure
Mhm.
as much as you'd think. And a lot of that is, reductions in NEAT, but also, reductions in, basal aspects in terms of like hormone production and things like that. So it's, in that makes it especially hard with lighter individuals because the temptation is to really lean into cardio, but that can also backfire after a while. And so I think the solution to this, or at least the way I approach it, is just really understand like an adequate timeline where you can keep energy availability as high as you can get away with is going to mitigate a lot of that. And so that's it's sort of the only way to kind of work around that unfortunate reality that lighter individuals have it a little bit harder.
And that's exactly why, especially with smaller individuals, and really, I mean, most of the time we're talking about females, right? But there are males that are small. We've had males compete at 105, 100, even less than 100 pounds, right? So it's not just relegated to females. We're just talking smaller humans.
Yeah.
And in those humans, I want really, if I can, to get their cardiovascular expenditure through aerobic exercise down to nothing if I can. Because, and this is where, man, with the step count and these little devices that count steps, I almost felt like that was a cheat code at some point. It just seemed so reliable that if you took somebody that was very inactive and they got on average 4,000 steps a day, if you just doubled it to 8,000 steps a day, it would move the needle. But yeah, getting back to those smaller athletes, if I can get away with having them doing zero cardiovascular training through aerobic training, we can do exactly what I just talked about. If they're an active person, we just get their steps up and we get the needle moving. But then you're right, Ryan, there comes a certain point, and it's interesting that you talk about that discussion with Mike and Eric, because I've noticed that, it's like, and it seems, there's probably not like a magic threshold, but at least what I've noticed, when you get above 12,000 steps a day to where it's like 84,000 steps a week, there is no change. Nothing happens
Yeah.
after that. It's like that seems to be the point when there's no return, right?
Yeah.
But, and why this is, I don't really know. Well, I mean, I kind of have a feeling, but I don't have evidence for it. But if you can just take that athlete that is doing zero cardiovascular exercise through aerobic training, maintain their steps, and now have some of those steps turn into what is cardiovascular training through aerobic training, it starts to move the needle. So if you're at kind of what I consider to be the max, 12,000 steps, and they're doing zero aerobic training, right? Just tell them, a lot of times I'll just start with just 2 sessions. I want 2 sessions after your weight training, 5 to 10 minutes. That'll usually get the needle moving. And I guess it's just because maybe the increased heart rate burns more calories, because of the sustained heart rate for 5 to 10 minutes. I don't really know, but it seems like it works pretty darn well with those individuals who are basically under 120 pounds, right? To get that needle moving without having to drop their calories every freaking day to 900, 850
Well, I mean, if you
or
go
whatever.
let's say you go from 10,000 steps up to 15, like, is it the same pace? Because at that point, you figure they're plateaued, right? Like you're factoring, okay, you're making the change because they're plateaued. So fatigue probably is going to go up from 10,000 to 15,000 steps. So am I going to walk faster or slower or the same pace?
Or
Like
is it
some
just going to be
people
more
might-
trips to the remote control?
Like some people might walk even slower, So, or some people get on a walking treadmill and they're working while they're on the walking treadmill. And I've seen this. I've seen people walk like, what are you doing? It's not a walk. It's just like a tick, tick, tick. It's like barely moving. So your step count's 25,000. But if you were to double that pace, well, now you're at 12,000 steps and you're burning more calories in less time. And the thing about that increasing to a high step count is usually the pushback you'll get is it's a time suck. Because if you're talking 12,000 steps, like most people are going to be allocating an hour to an hour and a half a day of just walking.
It does become a challenge. Yeah.
So that's a stressor in itself. So it's like, okay, even if it is a small individual, it's like, is 100 calories less? Is that going to probably work out better? Or is it like cranking their steps way up? And I think it's just a case by case. It could be the same person, but it could just be context dependent on where they're at.
Yeah, and their
in the
rate
process.
you might have to pick a middle ground that's sustainable and accept a slower rate of loss, and so that's why the timeline becomes even more important. But yeah, anecdotally, and interesting to hear you say kind of 12K, Brad, because it does seem like once you get north of that, it's pretty unreliable in terms of additional benefit. And I've always wondered, okay, is this like the constrained energy model that I talked about? Is this that at work, or is it the fact that usually at that point people are pretty shredded already? What we're digging through the last bit of fat loss, and is it more so just water retention from all the steps and walking and stress, and that's often there's more volatility and weigh-ins at that stage of prep anyway. So, but it's probably a combination of both, honestly. And, but it is tricky when you have, limited time and you have to create the deficit somehow. Like how do you go about doing that? And in those situations, sometimes pulling back on food is going to be the way to go, but it can still, there's still going to be reductions and, it's not going to resolve all of the issue. Like there's still going to be compensatory aspects of that too. So, I think lighter individuals, they just have it harder in that regard.
Yeah, for sure.
So all the years you guys have been coaching since tracking steps, what's the highest you've seen someone's step count?
I saw, I had someone the other
for an
day.
Athlete?
Purposeful or not purposeful, either way. Like
I don't think I've
and what's the
purposely...
context around that?
Okay. I don't think I've purposely gone above 15. And even that felt a little bit like, okay, I feel like I shouldn't have to be doing this.
Yeah.
And it didn't pan out the way I had expected, really, to be honest. but it was, near the end of a prep, getting the last bit off. But I had somebody report 35,000 the other day they were not intentionally trying to get as many as they could, but
just
they
a
were
day or
out,
like an entire week?
Just a day, just a day. They were just on their feet all day. I forget what the context of the situation was, but like some of it was deliberate, but it was also just a physically very active day outside of exercising. But I think the most I've ever recorded since, having a Fitbit was like 25. And that was when we went to Universal Studios with the family. My feet hurt. So it was...
Same was my anniversary in San Francisco. We walked all around San Francisco. My step count was like 24,000 that day. And I was like, oh my gosh, the next day I was so just wrecked. Yeah. But my prep, this last one, I averaged anywhere between 8 to 12. That was kind of like 12 was, I went over that a couple times, but not like for like weeks on straight. It was just like a couple days here and there. But for the most part in 2019, there was stints where I was like 15 to 18,000 because my food level was low. And from an adherence perspective, I know if I dip too low, I'm going to binge. Yeah. So I just chose to dig through steps and activity. But that required a time suck because it was literally an hour of walking in the morning and then another 45 minutes in the afternoon because during the day I'm pretty sedentary. Now, as far as programming other people, I usually cap things at 15. Like I try not to get anybody higher than that. And it's more so it's like most of the time it's going to be anywhere between 6 to 12, like you were saying, Brad. Like for you were 10K at the last stretch. I have someone right now who's doing 20 to 25,000 steps a day. And this is because of a personality. They're very active. They're very like high energy people, even prepping high energy. This is our third prep together. The first prep, the first two were more like I was trying to be more conservative with step count because it was getting like neighborhood of 15K. I'm like, this is too much. I'm like, hey, let's not go over this. And it was almost a stressor for them to stay under 15K. And eventually I learned their personality more and more. And it was actually a stressor for me to try to keep them down. So I just allowed them to go higher. So now 20 to 25K is almost like their normal baseline.
Jeez.
But like you said, so that's their baseline. But I know better than to say, okay, we're going to do 30,000 steps now. If we're
just tell them to double it or whatever. Yeah.
It's if we need a little extra to get some more fat loss, I used to say, hey, let's make some of that, like riding the bike or something, like get a little more expenditure for that activity, or we're going to drop calories down. And the calories has been the most predictable way to get the fat loss that we're seeing.
Yeah, because it all comes down to calories most of the time. That is the most predictable way to get the needle moving is the intake. I got to back up though just a little bit because me being the competitive guy that I am, I got you guys both beat on steps. During Snowpocalypse March, when we had no power for 4 days, and I had to clear my driveway of snow, and then I had to go do my in-laws' driveway and clear theirs of snow, and I had to do that 2 consecutive days in a row. I had 39,354 on March 2nd. I had 34,755 on March 3rd. And I don't say that to brag because, maybe a little bit, I should say, forgive me, Lord. Anyway, I kind of think in terms of more weekly expenditure, right? Because I mentioned before, like 84,000 a week is kind of like my cutoff. I don't like to get above that, which is about 12,000 steps a day. Because what I do a lot of times is I do basically prescribe just that. I'll just say, okay, I really don't really care too much. I do want you to get at least probably 8,000 steps in a day, but more so our goal, remember Jeff, my program was 1,770,000 steps, right? 1,700 calories a day, 70,000 steps a week. And I'll just tell people, okay, you know what? If it's summertime, I just want you getting out, mowing the lawn, sweeping the driveway, yard work once a week. And you know what happens? That one day they end up getting between 18 and 22,000 steps. And then the rest of it, they can just kind of go through life without it being such a time suck. And they end up meeting the 70,000, 75,000, whatever. So like with you, Jeff, I say, okay, Jeff, you know what? One day I want you to go outside. I want you to wash your truck. I want you to wash this slingshot.
It's too hot. It's too hot, Brad. It's 100 degrees outside. No, man.
I figure it out. But that seems to work pretty well when I'm thinking, because that's a lot of times I'm a big picture thinker anyway. I think in terms of weeks and months and how can we make this kind of like more like an average, and then it's not, quite such a time suck.
I feel more confident in giving something like that to people who I know are very on top of it. Like they have a good daily routine, and because I can see the flip side of that, where someone who's like, maybe they're a little too loose and they're like, well, it's Wednesday. I still have the rest of the week to make up for it. Mm-hmm. And then at the end, they're like, well, shit, now we're like 40,000 steps behind.
Piggyback off of that, Jeff, is if there is somebody who's more susceptible to kind of hoarding their steps, for lack of better words, we need to remember recovery is an ongoing thing, so it's like your recovery on that day that you're, redlining steps is not going to be great.
No, and I can vouch for that, because after those 2 days on the snowpocalypse, oh man, I was suffering.
Yeah. That's why for you, Brad, I was like, okay, you said 70,000, but like, I'd rather just see you hit 10,000 every day.
Every day, yeah.
Because you're more stable that way.
Yeah. And I usually operate in ranges too, like 9 to 11, if I'm aiming for the average. But I think the same thing, like I have an athlete who recently finished a fat loss phase and is transitioning into the surplus. And he had kind of floated the question, like, okay, could I eat in a deficit most of the week or right around maintenance, and then in the weekends with family have more calories to work with? And I think that, as like a bottom line checks and balances, like as a simple math equation, you're like, that seems to make sense. But you're not really leveraging the power of having a surplus, 5 out of 7 days of the week. Yeah. So, and we know when we train, it's like we're building muscle for about 48 hours after we train. That's how, on average, roughly, like protein synthesis is elevated. So it's there. You can't make up ground with a larger surplus later in the week. And I think the same thing can kind of be said for steps. And when it comes to just overall systemic recovery, it can definitely put a dent in things if you have snowpocalypse, for example.
Hey 3DMJers, this is Andrea Valdez popping in to let you know all about 5 of our free courses that you can take inside the 3DMJ Vault. For those who don't know, the 3DMJ Vault is our all-in-one video-based education platform for bodybuilders, powerlifters, and serious lifters of all types. It's essentially a place where we house and organize all our best information in hopes of creating our ideal future 3DMJ athlete or future physique or strength competitor. In total, there are over 25 video courses in the vault, and it continues to grow every year since we started it in 2017. If you want to sign up to be a VIP member, you can make a one-time purchase to access every single one of those courses at any time. But if you're not ready for that just yet, we do have 5 free courses that can help you learn some key concepts and give you a feel for what our courses are like. The first free course most people start with is the Vault Quick Start Guide, which lays out our suggested order of learning for lifters depending on where you are in your training career and what goals you have at any time. The second free course is our most recent release, the Pro Bodybuilder Case Study. And in that one, Coach Brad Loomis walks you through a 3-year contest prep planning arc with one of his pro bodybuilders who also competes in powerlifting. He'll show you progress photos, spreadsheets, and all that good stuff along the way. Thirdly, one of our more popular free video courses is the Recovery Diet. And in it, you'll have Dr. Eric Helms teach you how we have our dieting athletes exit their contest prep phases and return to the off-season in the most efficient manner possible. That one also includes a PDF download and recovery diet calculator made by Coach Brian Miner as well. And our 2 final free vault courses were each created by one of our 2 team's specialists. We have the Sustainable Fat Loss course by our registered dietitian, Steve Taylor, and the Blood Flow Restriction Training course by our injury reduction and management specialist, Dr. Nick Licamelli. You can become a free Vault member and get all 5 of those free courses by signing up at 3dmjvault.com. Just pick your free course and click enroll now to get started. Again, that's 3dmjvault.com to sign up and become a free or VIP member. Thanks so much for listening and enjoy the rest of the show.
Cardiovascular for like appetite, right? How often do we see a little bit of cardiovascular exercise kind of stimulate the appetite a little bit, right? Because a lot of times I will try to get my athletes to get their aerobic exercise down to nil. But there comes a certain point when we're trying to gain in some of these athletes to just have, squirrel-like metabolisms where they're just eating, everything they can and they can't. It doesn't seem like they can get enough food in. They're just always full. Sometimes just adding that little bit of cardiovascular exercise, even if it is just something where you sustain your heart rate on a step mill or something like that for 10 minutes after one of your weight training sessions, they seem to be a little hungrier. It seems like they want to eat more calories. I don't really know why that is. I've heard it and encountered it on more than one occasion, but just want to kind of throw that your guys' way and get your thoughts on that. And, if you've ever, kind of used a similar strategy.
I haven't. You can't think of when I've used it.
Maybe not to do cardio just so you can eat more food.
Yeah, but I definitely, I think it's a valid approach in that situation if you know they're hungrier. If you're in a gaining phase and they say okay, well, isn't this counterproductive to be doing additional cardio? If they burn 100 calories, but they can consume an extra 200 as a result, that's a net benefit. That's a net,
exactly, yeah.
So I can see the utility of using that. I've just never really had to. And I also know it varies person to person. I know if I do, if I did an hour of cardio, if anything, it might suppress my appetite for a couple hours after.
Yeah, because I could see that might be a strategy for our resident dietitian, Steve Taylor. I mean, you guys haven't really seen, the numbers that Steve has, but because I've prepped him for two different competitions, that guy's got kind of a squirrel's metabolism. He's got a whole lot of calories that he can eat, and not put on any weight, and just at a personal preference, Steve doesn't want to quote unquote bulk and get to that level. But, I kind of feel like that would be something that it's like a 5, maybe at most 10 minute, time investment. Like you said, Brian, and this is kind of something else we can touch on is, boy, it sure does hard to get those calories, on that little machine there to equal that donut that I had the other day as far as calories in versus calories out, right?
Yeah.
But if you can make a little 5-minute time investment, burn 50, 80, 100 calories, and it may cause you to eat 250 more. It's kind of an interesting little, anecdote that I've noticed.
For sure. One thing, have either of you experienced with athletes situation where maybe they're not as kind of educated on some of the ins and outs of what to expect and some of the numbers behind these things, but on more than one occasion, even recently, I've had somebody who's in a fat loss phase who has a day of high physical activity, like a 20,000 plus step day, maybe it's hot out, and they come to me the day after and they're discouraged because they didn't drop weight. It's I think it's really important. I know it's not really the topic of this discussion, but
it is important though.
It you can't expect the prior day's expenditure to really be reflected on the scale in a predictable manner.
In fact, oftentimes it's the opposite, right?
It's opposite. If you're sore, he had gone up and he said, "I'm really sore from walking." Well, you've got inflammation,
lactic acid.
DOMS, this is all expected. So, and really, I mean, if you, at one point I had looked at the math of it. Hopefully I'm not too off base here, but I think for walking, for an average height individual, walking 3.5 miles an hour on flat ground, if you were to just sort of assign a caloric value to 1,000 steps, I think it's somewhere between like 30 and 40 calories. It's not a lot.
Right.
And then when you consider adding that on top of what they're already doing, think like, okay, how much is this actually going to move the needle? Knowing that there's going to be an increase in inefficiency to like, you're not going to be burning 30 or 40 per 1,000 steps past a point. You know, it's going to be lower. And obviously the nature of those steps has a huge impact to kind of, you know, what you said, like replace some of those steps with dedicated cardio. But yeah, I think that's another thing I wanted to point out.
That's why we stress looking at the weekly averages
Exactly.
as far as like your rate of loss. And even then it's like maybe you're not even looking at a week, and maybe it's looking at 2 to 3 weeks.
Exactly.
To kind of see what the changes are there. But to look at day to day, like there's just so many different fluctuations there. Like you say, if they step 20,000 and their average is 12, it's like 8,000 extra. Like how many actual calories is that?
Yeah. Like, would you really expect that to be observed on a scale?
If it's a quarter pound of, like, is that really a quarter pound of fat? Let's just say, let's say technically it would be, but is it going to show up? Especially if there's like fluid fluctuations, bowel movements,
and so it's
maybe you had like extra sodium that day as well, so it's masking anything.
Yeah. So if it's
again,
hot out and you're replacing those electrolytes. And
so it's important to take that big step back and look at the weekly averages or biweekly.
Yeah, because I mean, it is important. It is kind of not on the topic of cardio, but I mean, there's just so many things that contribute to the changes in body weight, right? Because you could easily, so you burned 10 grams of fat by getting those extra 800 steps or whatever, right? And why can't I see that on the scale? Well, everything you guys just mentioned, you know, let's use Nick's favorite term. It's multifactorial, right? You had a little bit more sodium and you're holding on to a little bit more water, you know, or I should say water, but fluids. You know, because you got that extra 800 steps, there's a little bit more lactic acid, there's a little bit more inflammation, all that's been masked, you know. I've also seen the opposite happen to where it's like, okay, you know what? I was dehydrated and I lost weight that next day. 2 days later, guess what happens? They get rehydrated. They just gain like a pound from one day to the next. It's impossible for your body to synthesize that kind of mass overnight.
Yeah. And that can reinforce like an unhealthy outlook on cardio too. It's like, okay, now if I don't do this much, I'm going to gain weight, you know? And so there's a large educational component to it that I think is, important to understand.
Yep.
So you can zoom out.
Yep. And that's the great point, because there's been times when I'm like, okay, we're going to do this and this and this. And I don't want you weighing yourself for the next 5 days. Well, that's okay for kind of dealing with the short-term mentality of that person, but you miss out on that educational component that you just talked about, Brian. Okay, now this is what I predict is going to happen. And then they get their body weight. It pretty much follows suit with what we were talking about. You know, there's that educational component. And it never fails. It's just like, oh, wow, I never really thought about that before. You know, it's like, well, that's why we do this for a living.
I want to switch gears.
Okay, so do I, ironically.
I'm older, so I get to go first. This is the beauty of being a little bit older. You get to go first, right?
Well, you are my coach, so go for it.
It's the older brother thing. Now, in 2019, because I was doing quite a bit of steps, like we're in that 15 to 18,000 threshold, I got an injury from walking.
Yeah, talk about that, Jeff. I was hoping you would bring this up.
I think it's the tibia, the muscle in the front of the calf, tibialis, right, Brian?
Anterior tibialis, yeah.
Okay, so that tendon that goes into the ankle got so inflamed, I could barely walk. It was the day before the mayhem, and I wasn't even sure if I was going to be able to get on stage and pose. That's how inflamed it was. So what I learned is like, okay, even walking, the repetitiveness of it, and there was pace to it, because it wasn't like a stroll in the park. Like I had some pace to my walking. So what I kind of learned was like, I gotta alternate my quote unquote cardio modalities. Yeah. So I went, okay, I'm gonna go to the bikes. I started riding my bike. That helped because obviously I was off my feet. So now, like sometimes when I assign step counts, if it's starting to get on the higher end, it's like, okay, maybe it's a good idea to switch Like, hey, let's ride the bike for a week and go back to walking for a week, or it could be every other day, or just in a sense, kind of giving yourself a break. It's the same concept and principle. Like you're sitting at your desk for hours and it's a good idea to stand up, go for a short walk, come back. Same principles apply. Yeah. So even with this last prep I did last year, there was stints where I'd ride my bike, stints where I would walk. And to be honest, I didn't notice any differences because I'm pretty consistent with my food intakes and, my daily routine of getting in that hour of activity in the morning. Like I didn't notice big differences in the rate of loss between a brisk walk and riding my bike at a light to medium pace.
So here's a question that I know, well, I'm curious too, but for different reasons, but someone I'm sure is thinking, okay, how did you equate that? If it's on a bike and you're wearing a watch.
I just did. I didn't equate it. I didn't say how many calories am I burning walking or how many calories am I burning riding the bike. I was looking at the weekly average regardless. So I was creating baselines in that sense. So how would I adjust if I needed to adjust activity level? It would be through time. It would be I'm going to go to 45 minutes or I'm going to go an hour and 5. I'll increase 5 minutes or I'll increase 10 minutes if I need to. But it was more so the calorie adjustments at that point. Because I was like, I'm not going over, learning from past preps, I'm not going anything over an hour. Anything over an hour, to me, it's excessive. So I was like, okay, let me just for me personally, I'm like, okay, let me just adjust my calories at this point if I plateau out. That's the thing is that oftentimes we think in weeks. Like if I'm going to increase my steps or increase my cardio or what have you, or decrease calories, it doesn't always have to be in 7-day increments. Sometimes just to move the needle, it might just be, hey, I'm going to do it for 2 or 3 days. And you get just enough of a deficit to get things moving. So and it comes down to timeline, like you're talking about earlier, Brian. If you have plenty of time to work with, then you don't have to always be so aggressive with your adjustments. You can be a little more conservative.
So I want to get back to the true topic of our conversation, and that was cardio, right?
I thought I just talked about cardio.
That was cardio.
I want to talk about, this is how I want to shift gears.
You're just mad because I went first because I'm the older brother.
I thought you were going to talk about earthquakes, like we were talking about before the call. Jeff schooled us on his earthquake knowledge.
On his earthquake knowledge. He was dropping all kinds of earthquake bombs.
I learned a number of things, actually.
That's what happens when you live in California all your life.
But no, what I want to talk about is I want to talk about HIIT versus LISS cardio, right? Because we know there's going to be some folks out there listening to this and say, hey, shouldn't bodybuilders be doing HIIT? Because it's more akin to their weight training and things like that. And what I kind of want to just kick that conversation off with is deep in prep. What I have noticed oftentimes is I feel like I'm dieting the most when I am doing 20 minutes of LISS versus 10 minutes of HIIT. I have no evidence for this. I have very little knowledge about this, except for just how I have felt. If I do 10 minutes of HIIT, or somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes of HIIT, it doesn't give me the same feeling like I'm dieting. You know what I mean? Whereas if I go do 20 minutes of LISS, arguably I'm not burning as many calories, because what do they call that? The post-exercise oxygen consumption or whatever, right? But boy, I sure feel like I am dieted when I do LISS for 20 minutes versus HIIT, for 5 or 10 minutes. I feel like I get that kind of, how you feel when you're your blood sugar's low and there's that lethargy and you're sweating a little bit.
Like your baseline feel, or while you're doing it?
Yeah, but baseline. Yeah, baseline. Throughout, kind of the day, So anyway, maybe you guys have thoughts on that, reasons, whatever. But, do we even think about that anymore as far as programming HIIT versus LISS or what have you?
I'm going to let the young guy go.
That's another perk of being the older guy. You don't get to go first if you want to, but you get to tell everybody what.
Yeah. I honestly, the only time I program HIIT is if we have severe time constraints and we need to move the needle on the expenditure side. I mean,
What
I've
do you
done
mean
preps.
time constraints as in like you're
So-
running out of time to get for the
So
for the goal?
let's say somebody, you know, they're training 3-4 days a week, you know, they're already kind of busy. It's like,
Okay,
well,
that's
increase,
yeah.
go to 12K steps. They're like, what hour are you
Yeah.
expecting me to come up with for this? Then I might do something like HIIT, but that's pretty rare, to be honest, for me. I guess it's interesting you say that, Brad, because I've kind of had the opposite experience, but there's also been some confounding variables there where I was also dieting more aggressively when I was doing HIIT. So I can't say that it was the HIIT necessarily, but I know I at the time I was doing sprints on the track, which was actually pretty fun.
Yeah, I've done that.
But
Yeah.
I mean, by the end of prep, it's like you get 10 yards down the track, you're just there's nothing in the tank.
Yeah.
You know, you're just kind of stumbling. But you know, with I don't know what new research has really come out on HIIT recently, but it does seem, you know, as far as I know, the consensus still sort of seems to be, you know, if try to keep it low impact to like minimize interference effect with resistance training. So like a bike or an elliptical versus sprinting, like anything that has like a braking element to it or like an eccentric element to a large degree is, you know, that can cause more muscle damage, which can interfere more with resistance training. But, you know, the prep where I just tracked steps was probably the easiest prep I've had. But I also was dieting on more calories than I had before. So it's hard to, it's a dangerous game to play when you can, you know, when people try to isolate it to one variable when there's other things. Cause
you can say, well, if you were eating the same amount of food and you were doing HIIT, maybe you would have recovered better from it.
Exactly.
Maybe if you program your training a little bit differently, maybe you can blend it all in together successfully.
Yeah, for sure. So, but if I do program HIIT, it's usually like I have an athlete right now doing HIIT it's largely out of preference. She just really enjoys doing HIIT. But you know, it's not like my go-to tool. It probably would have been in like 2010 if I, you know, and a lot of prep coaches. I mean, I remember
that was
watching
thing back
Lane
then.
Norton push his sedan down the street.
Yeah.
You know, doing car pushes and everything. And I don't know many people that are still doing that. But I think they can both be very effective. But the cardio doesn't have to be, it shouldn't be a training, like it shouldn't feel like resistance training in my opinion. Like we use the weight training to build and maintain muscle. The cardio just chips away at expenditure. That's how I view it.
I don't prescribe HIIT just because I don't think it's necessary for a contest prep.
I don't think it is.
It's
either.
like if you have someone who's weight training 4, 5, 6 times a week, I mean, that's pretty demanding in itself. I know even like when I first started coaching and you know, I seen Brad do all these crazy HIIT things and, you know, Eric was doing them. Like, I was like, why are they doing these? Like, I don't care what the science is pointing to. I'm like, this common sense is telling me this is hard. Like, I'm already weight training hard enough. Why do I want to do more hard stuff on top of this?
Yeah.
Maybe bodybuilding's not for me.
So I was happy just getting on my recumbent, which I still have, by the way.
Yeah.
It's over there in the corner. I'll get on there and I'll watch a movie or I'll do whatever and just get some expenditure that way because the goal is fat loss. And I'm like, okay, I'm getting enough conditioning with my weight training. So that was just my perspective on it. And not to be a fear monger, but I had an athlete in that era and I didn't prescribe HIIT. It was more just like, hey, I just want you to do some LISS for all the reasons I just said. And he went ahead and did it anyway. And it was sprints. He ended up tearing a quad.
Quad, really?
Yeah, he tore a quad and then basically he was done. So prep was over. So he never finished. He never crossed the finish line. So it's, you know, if you're not used to doing something like that, it's like if you do end up doing HIIT, it's like, well, start slow and let's taper that in. Don't just go like a bat out of hell. But I mean, back then it seemed like it was really glorified though. Like watching you, Brad, like going at it. I was like, yeah, that's pretty cool, man. Like he's hardcore.
I cringe at it today though, because knowing what I know now, you know, compared to what I knew back then and what I did back then, it's kind of, I don't know, I kind of cringe at it a little bit.
I
I
mean,
look at
it
it this
builds
way.
some work ethic. I mean, you know what hard work feels like.
Yeah.
I think that shouldn't be understated. And
Yeah.
I think that's
Yeah. But at the time, I mean, I had zero evidence about it. I just, in my brain, I was thinking to myself, weight training is HIIT-ish. You're pushing hard for 12 reps, 15 reps, whatever. Your heart rate's jacked, and then you rest for 2. And then you just rinse and repeat just over and over and over again as you're going through your session. So I was like, well, I'm going to pattern my cardio to be similar. I think it'll make more sense to make it I'll be anabolic, kind of a component to my weight training, That was the sense that I made of it at the time. But I'm pretty sure that's probably been, debunked now over the course of a decade since we did that.
If you guys told me, Jeff, I want you to do HIIT twice a week, and like each session you're going to burn about 300 calories, I'm like, I think I'm going to eat 1,500 calories that day instead.
and go ahead, Jeff. You go first.
That's all I got to say. It's like I'm still going to get my deficit, but I'm not going to go because the recovery factor
exactly
after doing that, it's going to be more challenging. Even if my calories are at 15, I'm probably not going to be as zapped. So the next day, if I do have a training session, like, hey, okay, I'm recovered, I can get a good weight training session in here. But if I'm fatigued from doing like some high intensity cardio and my legs have nothing in them, I'm like, okay, what's my training going to look like?
Yeah, and that's exactly usually my rebuttal to my athletes, that they are rare, because HIIT is becoming kind of more and more rare in the use of bodybuilding prep, right? I'm like, you know what? 2 things. Number 1, what do you want to be better? Do you want your cardio to be better, or do you want your weight training to be better? Because the cardio that you're talking about with this HIIT is going to affect your weight training in the next couple of days, being in a deficit and being fatigued, from doing that cardio. I would rather you just eat less food, than to have you do that and then get better weight training session from that. And then number 2, Jeff, just circling back to, you don't want to be a fearmonger, and I don't want to be either, but you still have to have an awareness that things like sprints, I mean, you're in a very vulnerable position when you're talking, your muscles are elongated to the max, right? And then you're forcefully contracting them the other direction in like a sprint, right? I mean, we see it all the time in team
at
sports.
8 or 9% body fat, or
exactly.
10%.
And you're not
back.
fueled.
yeah.
You have to be aware of the precarious position that your muscles, your tendons, your body is in when you're in that state. And on top of it, you're not used to it. And just to give an old man's cautionary tale, 40 years old, I went out, part of a prep, and I wanted to play on this gridiron football team, right? And we were out there, and I'm one of the faster guys out there, and I'm showing off, trying to sprint, and chase these balls down and et cetera, and I strained my groin, and that groin bothered me for like months. That same spot bothers me to this day, 12 years later. And I hear this from athletes all the time. They pulled this hamstring in track when they were 38 years old, and now they're like 48 years old, and they still feel it to this day, So just, I, like you, Jeff, I don't want to fearmonger, but I think that a certain amount of awareness of what the repercussions of these things might be if you carelessly and start doing these, these techniques all for bodybuilding purposes, right? When, like we talked about at the very beginning of this call, is cardio really even needed to get to uber levels of low body fat and bodybuilding condition?
I think sprints sort of stand alone there in terms of, well, not completely alone, but they're by far more risky than like a recumbent bike.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think, anything where you're reaching very long muscle lengths and having a forceful concentric, like that, you're you may be playing with fire there a little bit in those stages.
How do you make that sound so much better than when I was trying to describe that, right?
No, I got what you were saying. I got what you were saying. I just didn't want
so much better.
I didn't want people to think like HIIT, like all forms of HIIT are created equal, because they're definitely not.
Yeah, but you definitely eloquently put what I was trying to convey.
But yeah, I'm not a huge advocate of using it unless it's just a time thing where it's like, okay, we just need to, you've got 15 minutes, we need to increase your deficit.
Mm-hmm. Time thing, and you just can't
Which
talk
honestly,
them out of it.
like, I can't even remember the last time that's happened, to be honest.
I can't remember the last time I assigned HIIT.
A small handful of times.
Yeah.
I said earlier, I was like, well, did I assign this person a HIIT session, or did I just drop their calories today?
Yeah.
And it's
maybe I've just thought about it. Just ended up pulling calories anyway.
Mm-hmm. And I feel like a lot of our athletes that we work with they're kind of on that level, and we will tell them, I think it would serve us better to just reduce calories here. And they're on board. They're usually like, yeah, that sounds a whole lot better than getting another 5,000 steps a day, or that sounds a whole lot better than adding another hour of cardio every week,
Yeah. What are sort of like, what is kind of the decision-making process there for us? Like if I know someone is starting to get really run down and just smoked, like cinder block for feet kind of feeling, as we've experienced in prep, I'm more inclined to pull back on calories than add additional cardio. And one of the telltale signs for me, like, is just the way they communicate. I think it's helpful having videos every now and then, or voice memos sometimes, if I suspect someone's kind of running on fumes. And I had an athlete a few years ago who, like, his voice memos, his prep went on, it's like
you can hear the tone.
His spoken words per minute just dramatically dropped off.
Yeah,
it's just like a sigh, and then just like stumbles out a few words. It's like, all right,
or the check-ins get a lot shorter. Maybe they're average of 5 minutes, and all of a sudden they're like 1 or 2 minutes.
Yeah.
So I think that's
Also, too, I think we're experienced coaches. We've been through prep many times ourselves. We've prepped so many athletes, so we know more or less like the phase of prep someone's in. We kind of expect, okay, at this stint of a prep, chances are fatigue levels are going to go up. They're going to start escalating. So sometimes we can be inquisitive too. How are you actually feeling? Are you starting to feel run down? Because the way I see prep coaching, it's like a lot of it's just fatigue management.
Mm-hmm.
There really is.
It really is. Yeah.
Fatigue management, and basically making sure people's emotions while going through the prep are as even keeled as possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because I mean, that's part of bodybuilding, is we got to hold on to the muscle. We got to have muscle when we're on stage, and if we're just burning it all off through cardio and low calories, it kind of defeats the purpose and what it is that we're trying to accomplish with the sport. I got one more thing, guys. Before I do that, do you guys have anything that you wanted to contribute?
I have one last thing, but you can go first.
Well, I've got mine written down, so you go first.
Okay. Well, I was just going to say, I think the way cardio's often programmed in bodybuilding preps is, it progressively increases across prep up until peak week. And I know we're advocates of kind of tapering cardio down and kind of just reducing stress levels physically as we cruise into a show. So, I think that a lot of people sort of have it backwards, and it goes back to the timeline thing. They're sprinting across the finish line when we want it to be a tapered kind of smooth landing where stress is very low going into peak week, and that it's going to lead to the most predictable look. The people that are personality wise, like, I think the people that are just more relaxed, it's just much more predictable for them come peak week in their look. So I think tapering cardio can have a huge benefit if you have the timeline to do it.
And steps or both.
Yep. And both, really.
Yeah. And just to put a visual to that, Brian, this last peak week that I had with Jeff, I'm still shocked that I looked as good as I did. I still cannot get over how good I looked. And I mean, not I'm not talking about.
I'm old, but I still think I know what I'm doing a little bit.
No doubt about it, brother. No doubt. But it's important to note exactly and reinforce what you talked about there, Brian. I was the most relaxed I have ever been going into a peak week. I gained 3 pounds going into peak week and finishing up peak week, right? And on the flip side of that, what caused that, Jeff just basically said, just let your steps naturally just taper down. No more of this 10,000 steps. Whatever you get is just whatever you get. I think one day I did
remove purposeful steps.
Purposeful steps. And I think
remove the purposeful steps, increase food. It's like you said, Brian, it's just you just reverse things. It's like, okay, instead of pushing so hard across the finish line, if you're pushing it your hardest, you're going to be the most depleted. It's going to be probably your worst look.
Yeah.
As a bodybuilder. So it's like, you need to reverse that. It's like bring food up, bring activity down, fill yourself out, bring stress levels down, eat a little more food, right? And you're ready to go.
And it's important to note purposeful steps, right? Because I did get 12,000 steps 3 days before the muscle mayhem, but it wasn't like I was trying for it. It just happened. And that was what Jeff reinforced. He says, no purposeful steps. Just let them naturally fall. Whatever they end up being is whatever they end up being. Well, the rest of the days were like 6,400 to be exact.
Yeah, they came down almost in half, and you had like more carbs coming in, more food.
Exactly. We did no cardio that week, which I don't know about you guys, but sometimes taking away cardio improves the look. And my hypothesis behind that is we eliminate the inflammation. All of the inflammation that comes from cardio is just, now it's gone. And with the uber low levels of body fat, the muscle actually
But no one wants
shows.
to do cardio at that point. They hate it.
For sure.
So it's like just the stress is being removed from that alone.
But how many of our athletes are like, oh, coach, I can't get rid of that cardio. I'll be gaining fat, or I'll lose the thermic effect or what. It happens all the time, and it's super important to just note that cardio does a lot more than just burn calories. And because we're a visual sport, you can make it look worse, when you're taking that kind of thing into context. All right. So Brian, I gave his chance to get his last thing. Coach, Jeff.
No, I'm
all right,
good.
Cool. So my last thing, totally unrelated to really for contest prep. I've experienced many times folks, especially in today's day and age, who are so inactive because they work at home. They're doing what we're doing right now. We're sitting here, right? That they actually have health issues from inactivity, right? And not just tight hip flexors, but I think, wasn't it just recently where they actually said that it was a detriment to your health to get less than like 5,000 steps in a day or something like that? Brian, you're kind of a little bit more up on that than I am.
I don't know, but I believe it.
Yeah. Yeah. But the reason I bring this up is that I've had many athletes that are in the off season, and I actually will treat their back pain, their hip flexors, things like that with movement, not maybe necessarily cardiovascular activity and cardio, aerobic exercise, but just vividly, I remember telling one person, look, when you come home from the grocery store, I don't want you being the bodybuilder that's going to get all the grocery bags in the house in one trip. I want you purposely taking multiple trips, when you come into the house from the grocery store. That wife is always running that vacuum cleaner, Why don't you take a chance or two at that and, get a little bit of that
We got a robot,
there.
Brad. We got a Roomba.
Oh, well.
There you go.
I'm keeping my steps low.
Peak week, bring out the Roomba.
Yeah, exactly. But I think it's important that it is somewhat of a treatment to do. Even me, myself, if I want to keep this groin thing that I've got going at bay, I just got to get on the stair mill and just test that thing. I not test it, but push it a little bit. And sometimes I feel it and sometimes I don't. But I notice that I'm a lot more resilient. My groin, I should say, is a lot more resilient when I do that kind of a thing. Do some step milling, or maybe just put the incline up on the treadmill and just walk real fast, or maybe just do a little bit of jogging. It doesn't bother me as much when I'm doing those kind of things for the purpose. I'm not doing it for cardiovascular activity or to increase expenditure. I'm simply doing it so that I have a little bit more resilience of that little 12-year-old injury now in my groin. So, I just wanted to throw that out there. Get your guys' thoughts on that.
No, I have athletes that are like similar, like off season or whatever. They're not in prep or cutting. They're inactive. They work from home or they work at an office and they're sitting all day long. Their step count's like anywhere between 3,000 to 5,000. Like you're not really moving. So usually like with people like that, I'll program anywhere between 6,000 to 8,000 steps because that's going to force them to get up at least 20 minutes out of the day and go for a walk. Or like, hey, it's okay if you get on a bike a couple times a week just to go ride the bike with your kids on the weekend or something like that. Just get moving. I don't think that's going to interfere with your weight training if you're you're taking a walk or you're doing a couple bike rides. Like that's not going to tap into your gains.
Well, I can honestly say that vacuuming my whole house, 3,500 steps guaranteed.
Well, the body's meant to move. The body's not meant to just sit all damn day. You're going to get stiff. Yeah. You got to move your muscles. You got to move your connective tissue. Otherwise, you're going to get super stiff.
Yeah. I mean, it certainly depends. Like it's like if somebody's injured and sometimes, if they're working with a PT, they may suggest, going back to that movement just very light, even though there could be some mild tenderness still. But yeah, getting stronger and kind of just getting used to that position, maintaining some mobility there, I think is important.
100%.
All right, guys, I think that we did it. So might drop there on the whole cardiovascular episode. So until next time, guys, have a great day.
What's going on, everybody? Eric Helms here, Chief Science Officer of 3DMJ. Thank you for listening to the podcast. And let me just take 1 second to tell you about MASS, Monthly Applications in Strength Sport. This is a monthly research review that I do with Lauren Colenso-Semple, Eric Trexler, as well as Mike Zerdos. These are experts in their field, and we cover all the information relevant to you as an athlete or coach if you're working with strength or physique athletes, or if you're a recreational or competitive athlete yourself. We cover nutrition, training, sports psychology, and health. And we do this in written format, as well as, since you like the podcast, audio summaries, as well as video concept reviews. If you're a trainer, we also have continuing education credits for ACSM, NSCA, NASM, and ACE. So head over to 3dmusclejourney.com, click on the products tab, and you can find us there. I look forward to seeing you and enjoy the podcast.